Hey everyone, today's story is about 24 high school students who suddenly died during a class trip, only to wake up reincarnated in another world. But there's one big problem. None of them came back as humans. So with that said, let's begin the story. The bus was traveling along a mountain road. A cliff loomed on the left, and on the right, a steep precipice, thickly overgrown with greenery, dropped away. Inside, the usual school buzz reigned. Some were teasing the teachers, some were belting out songs, and some are laughing at others' jokes. A routine trip, a routine day. It happened suddenly, just as all truly terrifying things do. The brakes failed. The driver, in a panic, tried to do something, his hands flailing at the steering wheel, but it was already too late. The bus flew off the road and crashed down into the greenery and rocks. A terrible disaster. 21 students from Midori Shino High School, a teacher, the driver, and the tour guide were killed in an instant. The protagonist, Indigai, struggled to open his eyes, moaning softly. His head was pounding, and his vision was blurry. In his hazy consciousness, dark silhouettes of some strange creatures began to emerge, vague and indistinct, like a dream on the verge of waking. A quiet voice called him a friend and said it was time to wake up. He opened his eyes wide, and in that very second, he recoiled in panic, his back slamming against the rough tree trunk. Real monsters stood around him, staring intently at him. The girl closest to him, her lower body like a spider's, thin antennae on her head, sharp ears, put a finger to her lips and hissed that his voice was too loud. Hovering in the air, next to her, was a large black eye with tentacles, which irritably told the guy to finally get used to it. A skeleton nearby took a few heavy steps and muttered that the rest stop was over. It was time to get going. The main character frowned, nodded, and silently stood up. Together with the others, those who had been his ordinary classmates just a short while ago, he approached the edge of the cliff and looked down. There lay the village, small, quiet in appearance, as if it suspected nothing. He thought intently that the thing they needed was right there. So it was time to move. Meanwhile, in the village below, things were far from quiet. The peasants had been herded out of their homes and into the square, roughly, without explanation. Men in armor lined up before the bewildered, frightened crowd. Ha'adaman stepped forward, a heavy-set man with a shaggy red beard and long, tangled hair held back by a leather strap. Broad shoulders, a rough, weather-beaten face, leather armor with metal plates, a heavy axe in his hands. He slung it over his shoulder, swept the crowd with a stern gaze, and smiled grimly. He asked loudly if everyone had gathered. The soldiers immediately reported, every last one of them, and they gestured toward the crowd. Ha'adaman exhaled with satisfaction and said that was good. He stepped forward and announced loudly that the villagers should listen carefully. He wouldn't repeat himself. Their unit was a group of monster slayers sent by the Holy Kingdom. The village was very lucky. A monster crystal had appeared in an abandoned church nearby, and it could break free at any moment. When that happened, the squad would be ready. So the villagers were obliged to praise the generosity of the Holy Army and bow low in gratitude for the honor bestowed upon them. An old man slowly stepped out of the crowd, leaning on a cane, and quietly thanked them for their protection. They had truly been very worried. Ha'adaman waved it off casually, and with a haughty smile, he announced that the village's supplies and several houses would be requisitioned for the army's needs. Bring all the food here immediately. The old man stumbled. He was silent for a few seconds, as if unable to believe what he had heard. Then, in a panic, he began to say that they had paid their taxes faithfully, but could barely make ends meet. Without provisions, they would all starve to death this winter. He lunged forward and grabbed the Viking by his armor with trembling hands, shouting that they had nowhere to go, that these were their ancestors' lands, that only death awaited them outside the village. Ha'adaman contemptuously shook off the old man's hands, jabbed his finger right in the old man's face, and said with a smirk that these were temporary measures. The knights would deal with the monster and leave. The old man wouldn't let up. His voice cracked, his words tangled with despair. Then, without another word, the Viking swung his axe and split the old man's skull open, grimly muttering that it was high time he shut up. The old man fell dead, heavily, as only a dead body falls. The peasants watched in horror, unable to move. A few people were the first to come to their senses and rushed to the old man, asking if grandfather was alive. Though there was no answer to be had, Ha'adaman stood where he was, blood dripped slowly from the axe blade. He theatrically wiped away non-existent tears and protested. God himself had sent his people. How dare these insignificant people defy his will? He scanned the crowd, which had fallen silent in terror, and asked mockingly whether demonic thoughts had clouded the minds of the other villagers as well. The peasants began swearing in unison that no, They were loyal subjects who would never dare to disobey. Hadaman nodded gloomily, noting that the simple folk here lacked education and upbringing, and turned to his subordinates. They clapped tensely and nodded in unison, agreeing that their lord was, as always, right. The man loudly proclaimed once more that they were brave warriors of the Holy Kingdom, and ordered the peasants to hurry up with the food. Just then, a strange noise came from the woods. The Viking spun around sharply, his hand reaching for his axe. From the thicket, along a narrow path, staggering like a zombie, emerged a skeleton in armor that barely clung to its bare bones. It gaped its empty mouth wide and stretched its arms forward toward the living, moving slowly and inexorably. Hadaman glanced at him casually and asked his men, "Can they handle it?" They exchanged mocking glances and nodded confidently. Meanwhile, the peasants began carrying supplies, heads bowed. The Viking glared after them and muttered under his breath that those damn peasants were annoying him. Turning at the noise behind him, he saw that the two soldiers who had just been boasting that they could handle the skeleton were lying on the ground, unconscious or already dead. The skeleton took a few unhurried steps toward the men and remarked with undisguised sarcasm that the whole scene was simply hilarious. The soldiers not only failed to protect the weak, but were themselves pushing them to their doom. After a pause, he added that they had no need for a god like that. He shook his fist and declared that all who merely pretended to be pious would be punished. They would face true divine judgment. The Viking and the remaining soldiers exclaimed in surprise that the skeleton was speaking. And if it speaks, that means it's a special kind. A cursed monster, not ordinary undead. In another part of the village, the soldiers exchanged glances, listening nervously to the noise at the gate. Captain Stringer approached them. He slung his sword over his shoulder, surveyed his men with a stern gaze, and briefly ordered them to pull themselves together. They were the elite squad of the Holy Kingdom. There was no room for panic, and anyone who made a single unnecessary sound, he would personally behead. The soldiers muttered tensely that they understood, grabbed their weapons, and rushed off on reconnaissance. One of those who remained remarked aloud that it was strange. No movement had been spotted near the abandoned church yet. The captain shrugged and said that Hadaman was probably having another fit of rage. How that man annoyed him with his lack of restraint. Meanwhile, the scouts began to sink into some thick, strange sludge right on the road. Their feet were sinking, their movements slowing. A spider girl glided down from the bridge above them and burst out laughing. She cheerfully declared them her prey. The soldiers shouted that it was a monster and that she looked like an insect. The girl exhaled a light cloud of mist and calmly said she wouldn't let them into the village. The soldiers yelled to attack her with their spears, but couldn't move. All their necks were suddenly wrapped in spider silk, thin and almost invisible. The spider mentally noted that the silk itself wasn't sharp, but the more a victim struggled, the tighter it tightened. And then they would all inevitably be dragged into her lair of suffocation. She glanced at the moon floating above the village and murmured quietly that she hoped her comrades were all right. Meanwhile, the paladins engaged the skeleton in open combat. They cast a spell to banish the unholy. A bright light enveloped the skeleton, and it vanished. Cheers rang out. Someone was already celebrating the victory. But in the next instant, the skeleton appeared behind them. And with a single sweeping motion, it cut off everyone's heads at once, without a word and without hesitation. Only the Viking remained standing. He thought intently. How could the banishment have failed? The monster stared at him silently, patiently, almost bored. Hadaman laughed and declared that the fact that this one had defeated these third-rate minions meant absolutely nothing. He grabbed both axes and charged forward. Using the technique of endless strikes, the blows rained down one after another, not giving the skeleton a single second to catch its breath. The monster crumbled into bones. The Viking burst out laughing. A weakling, no threat. In this world, there are the blessed, creatures endowed with special power, to whom true authority belongs. But even this dead body knew a thing or two. The next moment, the skeleton reassembled itself from its bones, as if nothing had happened. The soldiers stared at it in panic. Hadaman lunged forward to strike again. He would keep hacking away at it until he destroyed it completely. The skeleton patiently placed blocks with its hands, parrying every blow. And then it said wearily that it was tired of it. He swiftly parried yet another attack. The skeleton whispered that the soldier's time was up. The next moment, he wielded the life-ending scythe. He ripped Hadaman's heart right out his chest. He crushed it in his hand and briefly wished him to go to the underworld. He looked up at the night sky and thought he would leave the rest to his friends. Meanwhile, in the church, Captain Stringer impatiently asked if the scouts had returned. There was a commotion outside, and he ordered irritably that they be tougher on the villagers. If they didn't obey, the soldiers would kill the children they had taken hostage. Stringer approached the crystal with the monster sealed inside, and he fell deep in thought, gazing at that cold, flickering light. Lately, such crystals had been appearing more and more often, and the creatures inside were growing ever more powerful. That was precisely why the Holy Army existed. That was precisely why the people should be grateful. Otherwise, a true great calamity would befall them. Behind him, the protagonist of ISEKAI'D appeared completely silently. He warned quietly and grimly that the man must not dare to touch the crystal. The captain spun around sharply and swung his sword, demanding to know who he was. The young man easily dodged the blow and jumped back. Then he leaned casually against a tree, as if he were just strolling by. The soldiers cursed. How did he even end up here? Where did he come from? The soldiers immediately surrounded ISEKAI'D in a tight circle, demanding to know who he was. And what was he doing here? The young man asked with a slight smirk. Were they the army of the Holy Kingdom? If so, they'd have to leave. The territory was already occupied. One of the soldiers shouted that he didn't look like an ordinary peasant, and the captain asked impatiently what he actually knew about this crystal. The protagonist snorted, closed his eyes, and calmly muttered that the captain should be worrying about something else entirely. The soldiers were outraged. How dare he mock the Holy Army? And they all rushed forward to seize him. ISEKAI'D shouted, "It's time!" furiously and leaped high into the air, summoning his comrade named Dian. The ground beneath their feet cracked with a deafening roar, and stone slabs split apart. And from beneath the ground rose a huge stone golem, slowly and inexorably rising to its full, gigantic height. The protagonist was already standing on its back, arms crossed. Captain Stringer exclaimed in panic, "What is the golem doing here?" ISEKAI'D briefly ordered the advance. The golem extended its arms and moved forward, unhurriedly, as something truly enormous moves, causing the earth to tremble beneath one's feet. Stringer cursed under his breath, ordered a change of formation, and sent the magic squad to stop the monster. The golem launched an attack, stone projectiles. Huge waves of stone rolled across the ground with a thunderous roar, knocking soldiers off their feet and scattering them to the sides like rag dolls. The captain did not retreat, ordering them to hold their ground, his voice drowned out by the general din. The soldiers who could still move closed in and tried to pierce the monster's stone hide with swords and spears, to no avail. The blades bounced off, leaving not even a scratch. They shouted that nothing could penetrate this hide, and they scattered in all directions. Stringer snorted dismissively, let the cowards run, and sent the magic squad in a battle once more. The paladins stepped forward, concentrated, and cast a freezing spell. The golem wavered, slowed down, and froze, bound by ice. Everyone exchanged surprised glances. No one had expected it to work at all. The captain ran forward with a triumphant look, muttering that everything was going as planned. He cast a great slash, and with a single sweeping swing of his sword, he severed the golem's arm. The monster lost its balance and fell sideways with a deafening crash. Stringer burst out laughing. The golem was no match for his sword. A body like that couldn't possibly withstand divine providence. He raised his weapon again for the next strike. Just then, he was stopped by a huge black flying eye with tentacles that appeared out of nowhere. The monster opened its fanged maw and cast the magical eyes ban, and the captain suddenly found that he couldn't move an inch. Meanwhile, ISEKAI'D climbed onto the crystal, looked down at his immobilized opponent, and muttered quietly that the man was caught. The next moment, he raised his sword and leaped down, but an explosion rang out right next to him. Stringer's subordinates cast a healing spell, instantly lifting the paralysis. The captain swung his sword sharply, and the blow barely missed its target. The golem behind him asked if he needed help. The eye monster asked mockingly, "Is the lad really going to let his prey get away?" ISEKAI'D playfully dodged the blow, shook his head, and ordered his comrades to deal with the remaining soldiers. Stringer gripped his sword more firmly and realized it wasn't his imagination. The guy really was working with the monsters. Could he be connected to the recent attacks? But even if so, the Holy Army cannot let him get away alive. The captain lunged forward sharply. He smirked, and suddenly, with a sharp, unexpected movement, he withdrew his sword, thrust his arm forward, and cast a fireball. ISEKAI'D barely managed to jump out of the way at the last second, cursing inwardly. Where on earth did that magic come from? Stringer laughed triumphantly to himself. This was his signature move. First, he pretends he doesn't know magic, and when the enemy lets his guard down and thinks he's escaped, he kills them. But this time, something went wrong. The hit was perfect. Dodging it was, in principle, impossible. How'd he do it? The man began swinging his sword furiously, attacking without pause. ISEKAI'D dodged every blow, diving under the blade, stepping aside, performing flips in the air with apparent ease. Stringer thought the guy must be using a blessing. Indigai finally landed, exhaled, and calmly remarked that he didn't know the man was a mage. The captain paid no attention to his words. He hadn't encountered such a blessing before. But if the ability was related to agility, that wasn't a problem. He spread his arms and fired several fireballs in a row, one after another. Indigai panicked and rushed away, weaving between the attacks. Stringer thought he needed to hurry. The monsters might return, which would only complicate matters. Besides, he wanted to take the guy alive. He cast a fire blade spell on his sword and rushed after him. The eye monster pointed its tentacle at the scene and muttered anxiously that its friend was under attack. The golem grimly agreed. After dealing with the remaining soldiers, the monster told Diane, "Go ahead." Indigai cursed under his breath as he ran. Thinking the captain was completely stubborn, he pulled throwing knives from under his cloak and reasoned that at this distance, he simply wouldn't have time to dodge. But Stringer effortlessly dodged all the knives with a single swing of his sword, and he shouted for the guy to stop. Indigai cursed inwardly once more. The captain steadily closed the distance and chuckled. He'd almost caught up. The guy didn't see where he was running, and a few seconds later, he ran into a heavy, locked door, a trap. Stringer stopped a few meters away and slowly, with relish, moved forward, raising his sword. Indigai, in a panic, pounded on the door with the hilt, screaming for someone, anyone, to open it. The captain behind him muttered grimly that he wouldn't get away this time. Indigai turned around and asked him not to come any closer. Stringer replied mockingly, telling him to calm down. He had no intention of killing him just yet. The fiery blade would immediately cauterize the wound. With a mad gleam in his eyes, he made a sharp swing. The protagonist shouted again for him to stay back. He darted sharply to the side, and with one swift motion, he pinned the captain to the door, piercing him right through. Stringer didn't have time to figure out what had happened. He only realized he was pinned against the tree and couldn't move. Indigai pressed harder on the hilt, driving the blade deeper, and mockingly asked the old man to forgive him. The next moment, the captain cast a spell, yanking the sword out of his back with a sharp jerk, and he flung the young man aside. He raised his sword and demanded menacingly, why was the boy consorting with monsters that threatened their world? Who was he? And what did he want? Just then, a huge shadow appeared behind the captain. He barely had time to turn around, and with a single, unhurried movement, the golem brought a massive chunk of rock crashing down on him. Indigai wiped his split lip and laughed, and he sincerely thanked his friend for a job well done. Then he explained to his now-dead rival. It was all very simple and obvious. These monsters were his classmates. A little later, all 5 of them, the 4 monsters and the protagonist, gathered again in the village. The villagers came out to meet them and bowed low. Indigai looked at them in surprise and asked his skeleton friend named Rin what was going on. Rin shrugged. He said he'd told the villagers not to thank them, but they still wanted to thank the knight who'd saved them. The thing is, he doesn't understand who exactly they mistook for a knight. Didn't the monsters scare these people to death? Indigai shrugged, and he walked silently over to the crystal. His friends followed suit. The eye monster crossed its tentacles over its chest and asked, "Who's there this time?" Indigai muttered that it was impossible to tell from the outside. The spider girl playfully suggested melting it. Maybe that would help him figure out faster. The protagonist nodded. He thought about how monsters weren't exactly loved in this world. People call these sealed monsters and enemies of God. And whoever is inside the crystal right now will be destroyed by the church as soon as they awaken. That is precisely why they fought and would continue to fight for survival. Indigai held out his hand, touched the cold surface of the crystal, and used his release ability. The crystal shattered into sparkling shards, releasing a dragon-like monster. The boy, with a warm smile, reached out his hand and greeted it. Welcome to the other side of the world, to the class of reborn high school students. In the deserted corridor of the Church of the Holy Kingdom of Belfine, Carolina, the loud click of heels rang out, clear, confident, echoing off the high stone arches. The girl strode rapidly toward the locked doors guarded by security, not slowing her pace. The guards greeted her cheerfully by name, Colonel, and thanked her for her hard work at the border. She nodded briefly and said she was requesting an audience with the Pope. The second guard immediately nodded in agreement and muttered that she could proceed. A girl with long, light hair, clad in full armor and holding a helmet in her hands, entered the room. An old man lay among the pillows on a wide 4-poster bed. He sighed heavily, opened his eyes, and looked at her. His gaze betrayed genuine satisfaction. He said he had been waiting for her, that she had done an excellent job. Colonel asked awkwardly if she had woken him up. The head of the church nodded almost imperceptibly and asked for a report in a barely audible voice. The knight nodded and replied crisply, in a military tone. The mission was complete. According to Lady Ashley's prophecy, the sealed monster in Goodo had been destroyed. Captain Stringer was now heading east to Navula. The church leader folded his arms heavily across his chest over the blanket, sighed, and muttered that she was quick, as always. He was glad he had chosen her as his heir. With her at the helm, the kingdom would be safe. At these words, Colonel frowned. Noticing the change in her mood, the old man gently asked what was troubling her. The knight said that the monster had been very difficult to defeat, and they had lost many soldiers. Then she lowered her head, her shoulders trembling slightly, and she added more quietly that she didn't have the strength to match him. Lord Pannon. Colonel took a few steps toward the bed and froze, tense. A maid stood silently a short distance away. The head of the church laughed. The laughter immediately turned into a cough, and muttered that she still lacked confidence. Then he continued. She had brilliantly completed a vast number of monster-slaying missions. Ever since he had appointed her heir, she had been attacked more than once, and had always emerged victorious. Colonel is a strong person, worthy of this role. He is completely convinced of this. The girl listened to all this in silence and looked away, not knowing what to say. Lord Pannon looked at her intently for a long second, sighed, and unexpectedly offered to teach her a lesson. The knight exclaimed in surprise. Was he serious? The maid immediately intervened and reminded Lord Pannon that the last time he had fought was over 30 years ago, and now he absolutely must not overexert himself. The elderly man on the bed laughed heartily and asked the heiress if she thought the old man had finally lost his mind. Colonel adjusted her helmet more comfortably and replied calmly that of course not. Then the head of the church nodded in agreement and said that they should practice a little before going to sleep. He raised his trembling hands above his head, and he clapped his hands almost inaudibly. The next second, Colonel found herself in a completely different place. An empty, boundless space with no walls, no ceiling, and no floor beneath her feet in the usual sense. No longer a room, no longer a church, nowhere. In a panic, she grabbed her sword, thrust it into what had been the floor, and began frantically looking around, asking the void where she was and what was happening. A faceless voice laughed somewhere nearby and said that here she could go all out. Let her take the sword. She'd forget that an old man stood before her, hold nothing back, and attack. Colonel quickly put on her helmet, and she looked around again, gripping the hilt. She could hear the old man. His voice sounded very close, but she couldn't see him anywhere. Worse yet, she didn't sense his presence at all, not the slightest hint of a living person nearby. Noticing her hesitation, the head of the church calmly announced that since she was hesitating, he would attack first. The next second, something brushed against her leg, a light, almost gentle touch that turned out to be nothing like it seemed. She looked down. A hand was sticking out of the floor. Colonel screamed. The hand turned out to be monstrously, impossibly strong. It began to toss the girl from side to side with ruthless ease. Then it suddenly let go and flung her several meters away. The knight fell heavily and slid across the smooth floor. She hadn't even had time to get back on her feet when, right where the hand had emerged, the current head of the church began to appear, along with a bed standing upright, as if it were perfectly normal. Colonel struggled to her feet, trying to catch her breath, and stared at him. The old man hovered right in front of her, light as a feather, utterly unperturbed. She couldn't believe it. This man was bedridden and had long since retired from military service. Lord Pannon had once been called the mightiest warrior, chosen by the heavens. They say that 70 years ago, he single-handedly defeated the 7 ruling dragons, a story that had always seemed like a beautiful fairy tale, an exaggeration, a legend. But now, facing him eye to eye, she realized it was the absolute truth. His power was terrifying on some physical level. Her legs buckled, her body refused to fight, her instinct for self-preservation screamed to run. And if she was completely honest with herself, Colonel didn't even understand what exactly he was doing or how. The old man began to split in two, to multiply. The silhouettes spread out to the sides, each as distinct and real as the original. Soon, 6 copies of him hovered before her, surrounding her on all sides. All of them simultaneously, as if a single organism, clasped their hands in a prayerful gesture and laughed, casting a spell of an enveloping ring of fire. The ground flared in a circle. A high ring of fire rose from all sides, cutting off any path of retreat. The knight froze in a fighting stance, turning her head intently. A trap. A perfect trap. Lord Pannon immediately cast the spell Falling Spirits. Colonel held her sword out in front of her, and she heard a growing howl behind her that made her blood run cold. She turned around and saw thousands, if not tens of thousands, of spirits rushing toward her from the dark sky in a huge swarm, wailing pitifully in a multitude of voices. Some were half decomposed, toothless, eyeless, with dangling limbs. The old man warned her mockingly to be careful. They were about to crush her. Colonel thrust her left hand forward above her head and activated the Imperial Shield, the last thing she had left. Lord Pannon sighed heavily, almost in disappointment, and waved his hand dismissively, and the entire massive swarm of spirits froze literally a meter above her head, suspended in midair as if time had stopped. Then a long, sharp nail instantly grew on the old man's index finger. He muttered, "What a pity." He moved in close and poked her neck with his nail, a light, almost imperceptible touch. Colonel gasped in surprise. The spirits simply vanished, dissolving without a trace. What on earth was happening? The next second, her eyes rolled back on their own, her breathing almost stopped, her legs buckled, and she fell to the floor, sinking into darkness. She woke up on a soft bed, in the familiar surroundings of the church. Barely having time to look around, she jumped up in panic and screamed. What on earth happened? A familiar maid stood by the bed. She pressed her hands to her face in fear and began to explain haltingly. The knight had been standing by Lord Pannon's bed, talking to him, and then suddenly, for no apparent reason, had collapsed unconscious right there. All the servants were very worried. Colonel sank heavily back onto the bed and stared into space, gathering her thoughts. Then she looked at the maid, apologized for the trouble she'd caused, and asked if Lord Pannon had said anything afterward. The maid thoughtfully rubbed her chin and muttered that she hadn't quite understood the meaning. But the Lord had said he himself hadn't moved, and that his heiress would be capable of the same. Colonel nodded silently and left the church. She decided to take a walk through the city to clear her head. She walked, mulling over what had happened, going over the details. If Lord Pannon hadn't moved, then it had all been an illusion. But no, an illusion can always be recognized by a scent or a barely perceptible change in air temperature, and there had been nothing of the sort. She looked at the helmet in her hands and thought further. One of the church leader's techniques had clearly paralyzed her. That was indisputable. But that terrifying power, that enormous sphere of screaming spirits, could those have been unreal as well? Then it must have been a partial illusion? She snapped herself out of it again. The longer she thought, the less she understood. And anyway, had the old man used more than one technique? Colonel kept walking and eventually came to a different conclusion, a more unpleasant one. It wasn't about Mr. Pannon's abilities at all. It was about her. She was weak, she'd panicked, and she hadn't been able to think clearly. She'd been too overjoyed when she was chosen as the next holy knight, and hadn't thought enough about what that actually meant. Even if her fate was already sealed, the future still couldn't help but worry her, and that was perfectly normal. Suddenly, she sensed something strange, a faint sensation of a foreign presence that an experienced fighter would never ignore. She turned sharply around the corner and walked a little further, and stopped in the middle of a quiet, narrow alley. Without turning around, she already knew. Behind her stood several men with daggers. Colonel spun around abruptly. One of the men laughed nastily. The leader stepped forward and said he had no personal grudge against her, but she would have to die anyway. She shouldn't have been wandering the streets alone. The girl closed her eyes. Master Pannon hadn't said much, and yet that fight had been useful. The attackers continued. Many would be glad if she disappeared. One even asked for forgiveness. Colonel froze and thought, here we go again. She was worrying because of her own immaturity. Just as Mr. Pannon had said, she simply lacked experience. She closed her eyes, took a few steps forward, right through the attackers. Every step was a swing of the sword. Soon, nothing remained of one of them. The entire alley was flooded with blood. Decapitated bodies lay on the ground. She thought she needed to subject herself to even harsher conditions. She had to become the guardian when Mr. Pannon was gone. She would inherit this country and manage on her own. Then footsteps were heard. Several soldiers burst into the alley with a report. Seeing the street, they asked in shock, what happened? Colonel shrugged and calmly muttered that she had been attacked again, then sternly asked if they could handle it. They exchanged tense glances and nodded. She nodded in response and asked one of them, what's in the report? The soldier cleared his throat awkwardly and mumbled that it was about the expeditionary force. Colonel gave him a grim look and asked irritably why they couldn't contact Stringer. The soldier turned pale and began to tremble. The entire unit seemed to have vanished. Colonel snorted to herself, just what she needed. She ordered a message to be sent to the commander. She would go there herself. Meanwhile, in a godforsaken village, in an abandoned church, the protagonist ISEKAI'D touched the crystal. He muttered, welcome to this world, and he cast the spell of liberation. The crystal shattered into pieces, and a light flashed. ISEKAI'D and his monster friends stared intently at the creature that had emerged from the crystal. Standing before them was a humanoid dragon. It dropped to its knees, stared at its hands, and muttered that it had been on a bus, that there had been an accident. He should have died. In a panic, he thought. So he was alive after all? Maybe a ghost? But that was strange. He began to examine himself. Where did the long claws come from? Where did the scales come from? He noticed movement behind his back. He'd even grown a tail. In a panic, he exclaimed that he had turned into a lizard and cursed. The skeleton moved closer to the only human in the group and, stuttering, muttered that everyone usually reacted that way. The protagonist laughed awkwardly and agreed. Everyone went through this. The guy had a lot to learn. He added that, for starters, they should figure out who this dragon was, though probably they could just ask him directly. Meanwhile, the dragon pinched his cheek, yelped, and made sure he wasn't dreaming. The flying black eye was the first to lose its patience. It flew up from the side and asked, "Who is this?" The dragon heard the familiar Japanese speech, gaped, and froze. The eye repeated the question. In a panic, the dragon swung his arm and punched the eye. Knocking it back several meters, he shouted for it to back off. Then he yelled for no one to come near. He wasn't tasty. He started swinging his fists, thinking he didn't know what was going on here, but he'd survive. He didn't want to die right after being resurrected. The eye lay on the ground, groaning heavily and muttering indistinctly that this guy was insanely strong. Indigai, standing slightly behind him, tried to call out to the dragon and shouted for him not to lose his mind. He ran closer, dodging the blows, and asked, could they just talk? The dragon lunged at the golem, striking it several times, to no avail. The golem grabbed it with both hands and boomed that it had caught it. The dragon cursed inwardly. He wouldn't give up for anything. They can't kill him. The next second, he unleashed a new ability, Dragon's Breath. He exhaled a massive column of flame straight at the golem. Taken by surprise, the golem released its grip. The dragon soared up on its wings and prepared to plunge downward again, breathing heavily with fear. The next second, he was entangled in strands of spiderweb. He struggled, but only tightened the knots further. Below stood the spider girl and the protagonist. Both shouted that they had finally caught it, and they ordered it to come down. A black eye flew in from the side and ordered him to calm down. And then he cast a weakening beam spell. The dragon roared. His body wouldn't obey, and it plummeted downward, crashing heavily to the ground. Indigai approached, called out, and loudly declared that they were not enemies. He pointed at him, smiled broadly, and told him to remember they were classmates. The dragon turned its head with difficulty and looked at him in surprise. Indigai pointed at himself and suggested he take a closer look. Didn't he recognize that cute little face? The dragon lowered his head and muttered that it was indeed that face. It was his old friend Guy. He wriggled free from the nets, sat down on the ground, and sighed heavily. He clicked his tongue and thought that there was no escaping Guy, even in another world. The protagonist stepped slightly to the side, held out his hand, and offered to introduce himself a second time. His appearance had changed, but he could still guess who was standing before him. There was a cross-shaped scar on the top of his head. The dragon struggled to his feet, bracing his paws against his knees, laughed mockingly, and said the protagonist was so clever. Then he decided to introduce himself anyway. Second year, Class C, number 10. The captain of Furious Roar, Storm Glen, Giran Takahashi, extended his hand to his former classmates and added that he was pleased to meet them. Guy was lost in memories of his past life in his home world. Takahashi Giran was a bully who considered himself the strongest in the neighborhood. He loved to throw punches, constantly got into fights, and tried to prove his superiority. On his path to greatness, he had only one problem: Guy himself. For the first time in his life, the bully was refused to fight. He stepped even closer, stumbled, and asked, "Are you scared?" clearly trying to provoke him. The protagonist didn't even look up at him, waved him off, and replied that his grandfather had forbidden him from using fighting techniques in street fights. Giran raised an eyebrow, clearly not understanding what he was talking about. Guy recalled his grandfather's words. The techniques he had taught him were not to be used in senseless brawls, and he would only train his grandson on the condition that he understood this. That was exactly why, sitting alone in the classroom, Guy had turned down the bully. He stood up from his desk, headed for the exit, and as he reached the door, he tossed over his shoulder that he'd made a promise to his grandfather, so Giran would have to back off. The other guy frowned in displeasure, watching him go, and snorted. One of the hangers-on hesitantly approached him and asked what they should do now. Giran gritted his teeth and declared loudly that he would never give up. Indigai was the winner of numerous jiu-jitsu, karate, and kendo tournaments, the strongest student at Midori Shino High School. If Giran defeated him, the title of strongest would be his forever, not just in name, but in reality. But the protagonist categorically did not want to fight. And so Girin started pestering him almost every day. Sometimes he would get down on his knees along with his hangers on and literally beg. Other times he would suggest drawing lots. If Guy's name came up on the stick, he would be obligated to fight. He would also put on a show by fighting his own sidekicks, demonstrating how fun it was, even though Guy couldn't care less. Once, Girin even offered Otani an autograph in exchange for agreeing to fight. He tried every method of persuasion, day after day, until finally a brilliant idea popped into his head. The two of them, Girin and Indigai, found themselves alone in an abandoned gym. They shook hands. The protagonist looked at him in surprise and asked why he had called him to the old school building. Girin laughed, scowled mockingly, and muttered that he had a proposal. He continued haughtily, "Since Guy says he can't use his hands and feet in a fight, then they could have a strength contest, using only their heads. That way, Guy wouldn't break his promise." Girin tapped his own forehead mockingly with his finger. The protagonist laughed and muttered that Girin had finally changed his tactics. He was even a little impressed by his stubbornness. He sighed heavily and agreed anyway. Girin hadn't expected a positive answer and exclaimed in surprise, "Is that really true?" The next second, Guy jerked his head sharply and headbutted his opponent hard. The other clearly wasn't expecting it and staggered backward. The protagonist frowned and said grimly that he should attack. If he lost, he'd better never touch him again. Girin straightened up and sighed heavily, and he shouted for Guy not to hold back, and they began to fight. For several minutes, muffled blows, shouts, and groans echoed from the hall. After a while, Girin was lying flat on the floor. For the first time in his life, he had lost. Indigai returned to the present, to another world where monsters exist. The dragon spoke. He realized that they had all been reborn. But he stared intently at his former classmates and asked indignantly, "Why did everyone become monsters?" The guys introduced themselves one by one. Takada Giyama from the weightlifting club, now a golem. Tanaka Masayuki from the astrology club, now an evil eye. Yuan Linley from a martial arts club, a skeleton warrior. Amahara Satoshi from the handicrafts club is now an arachnia. Satoshi covered her mouth with her hand, stepped forward slightly, and said enthusiastically that they had really cool nicknames. The protagonist asked them to remember this well. Girin, in the form of a dragon, roared furiously that he didn't care about that, and turned to the protagonist. Why had he remained human? How was that even possible? Indigai froze thoughtfully and muttered that he didn't know himself. He'd woken up already in this form. The dragon grumbled sullenly that he was incredibly lucky. He, too, would have preferred to remain human. The protagonist muttered thoughtfully in reply that he wouldn't say he was lucky. In this world, being human isn't all that great. Girin looked at him in surprise. Just then, a familiar voice called out from behind him. The dragon spun around sharply, and he saw the following scene. An arachnia girl had caught herself on a tree branch with her web and was swinging back and forth, shouting excitedly for everyone to look. A monster's body is actually incredibly cool and agile. She cheerfully continued, saying that humans couldn't do that, but monsters were capable of so much. The dragon crossed his arms over his chest in displeasure, glancing at her out of the corner of his eye. Indigai thoughtfully rubbed his chin, looking at his former classmate, and muttered that there was no body more suited for survival in this world. Then he turned to Girin. After all, he was now much stronger than an ordinary human. He'd just been breathing fire. How could he have forgotten? The dragon stared thoughtfully at his own paw, clenched into a fist, and in the next moment, he grabbed the protagonist's arm and threw him to the ground. The boy screamed in panic, asking what was happening. Girin growled menacingly and confirmed the protagonist was right. In the real world, he couldn't defeat Guy, but here, everything was different. The dragon smirked darkly and asked in a nasty voice, "Well, are you giving up?" The guy struggled to hold the dragon's paw, groaned quietly, and shouted irritably that the bully was asking for it, as always. He trembled slightly from the tension, and in the next second, the situation completely reversed. Now the dragon was lying on the ground, and the protagonist's sword was pressed against its neck. Girin opened his mouth in panic and began to mumble that he understood everything. It was just a joke. When both had calmed down a bit, the dragon asked how an ordinary man had managed to flip a huge dragon's carcass. Indigai coughed awkwardly, sheathed his sword, and, staring intently into space, said that one day he had decided never to lose again. A little later, all the former school children, now monsters, were sitting around a large campfire. The protagonist recounted how he had woken up in this world. Girin gasped in astonishment and muttered that from everything he'd heard, it followed that the protagonist had been the first to find his twin sister. He'd certainly been lucky in that regard. If he remembered correctly, her name was... Indigai cut him off and said her name was Miel. Then he continued the story. His sister had freed herself from the crystal on her own, and it was then that he realized he had ended up in another world. The girl was no longer an ordinary human. Soon, the two of them were attacked. Several vampires grabbed the protagonist, twisted his arms behind his back, and wouldn't let him break free. The leader of the vampires knocked his sister unconscious and hoisted her onto his shoulder. ISEKAI struggled with all his might, screaming furiously for them to let her go. The vampire in a tailcoat, with light, curly hair falling to his shoulders, smiled smugly, paying no attention to the screams. His guard stood nearby. He called himself the Lord of the Vampires and whispered quietly that he had finally found her, his bride. His lineage had been waiting for this for over 1,000 years. He flapped his wings, rose into the air, and caught the girl more comfortably. His subordinates asked what to do with the man. The Lord of the Vampires, Dan, laughed and ordered them to throw him into the valley. ISEKAI reached out to his sister, calling her name, begging her to wake up. The vampires paid him no mind. They were incomparably stronger. The next second, the protagonist was already falling off the cliff and soon lost consciousness. It took me away. After all, in this world, she had been reborn as a vampire. Returning to the present, ISEKAI cursed furiously and pounded his fists on the ground. He was shaking with rage. He muttered that if he were stronger, they wouldn't have taken his beloved little sister. Why didn't he have superpowers like the rest of his classmates? Gira interrupted him and muttered that he now understood the whole situation. After their grandfather's death, Mio was Guy's only family. The protagonist nodded silently. He continued, there was only one lead, but he would definitely find this Dan and free his sister, even if it cost him his life. His classmates looked at him with sympathy. The skeleton warrior Yuan leanly spoke up. He said that, among other things, there were also the armies of the Holy Kingdom in this world. They called people like them sealed monsters and wanted to destroy them. Tanaka Masayuki, the evil eye, added that there could be no negotiations with these fanatics. If you encounter an armed unit, it's almost certainly the kingdom's people. He whispered in confusion. Why do they hate monsters so much anyway? Amahara Satoshi Arachnia yawned widely and remarked boredly that the name says it all. A theocracy, and there it's customary to fear the unholy. The protagonist snapped out of his memories and spoke up. He said fiercely that they would be smarter. They need to get ahead of the Holy Kingdom's troops, free their comrades, and become stronger. Class 2C had no allies left. Quietly, he added bitterly that they had ended up in a very cruel world. He rubbed his chin thoughtfully and muttered that he didn't dare hope for complete safety, but he still wanted to find a place where everyone would be happy, both monsters and humans. He was interrupted by a strange noise from the forest. A little girl who looked like an elf was running quickly through the thickets, pointed ears, a light silver tiara on her fair hair, and a dress made of fine fabric. She could hear the sound of footsteps growing louder behind her. Two men on the backs of huge boars were chasing her. One cheerfully shouted to his partner that they'd get a hefty sum for this girl. They couldn't let her escape. The second one grinned widely and replied that he knew. The girl, in a panic, thought they were about to catch her. And in her mind, she begged anyone for help. Suddenly, a clearing appeared ahead with a bonfire, around which several creatures were sitting. She screamed desperately, begging for help. All the monsters turned around. The girl froze, her eyes wide, and in that very moment, she fainted. The main character rushed to her, asking if she was all right. The evil eye and the dragon immediately began arguing over which of them had scared her. The skeleton warrior tried to calm him down. Guy shot them an annoyed glance and ordered everyone to hide. Someone was approaching. Two pursuers rode out onto the clearing on boars. The protagonist sat alone, holding the unconscious girl in his arms. One of the men mockingly ordered him to hand over the girl. ISEKAI stood up, glared at him, and didn't budge. The bandits exchanged glances, raised their weapons, and shouted at the boy to answer when spoken to. Guy just thought that these failed kidnappers were very noisy. A malevolent eye appeared behind them and cast a charm spell. It mentally addressed the boars. Were these men worthy of such treatment? Let them remember their days of freedom. The beasts grunted dreamily. The next second, both kidnappers were on the ground. The boars had furiously pounced on them. The men didn't understand what was happening. They tried to fight back, but in vain. A few minutes later, the boars left the dead bodies in the clearing and retreated into the thicket. The evil eye approached the protagonist and muttered smugly that the spell had worked. The dragon said thoughtfully that he'd seen something similar in movies, where they fed corpses to pigs to get rid of evidence, and it was horrible. The others stepped out of the shadows and asked what was wrong with the girl. Guy replied that Satoshi had stayed with her. Everyone came closer. Satoshi said she was asleep. They looked closely, long ears. Could she really be a real elf? For a while, the elf girl lay unconscious, leaning her back against a tree. Gradually, she began to come to. She moaned softly in pain and struggled to open her eyes. Almost all the monsters were sitting by the fire. Only Arachnia remained by her side, not moving a step away. Noticing the movement, she gasped with joy and loudly announced to the others that the girl had finally woken up. The elf screamed in panic. She pressed her back tightly against the tree, instinctively trying to make herself as small as possible, her eyes wide with fear. Indigai approached her slowly. He stopped a few meters away, making no sudden movements, and tried to calm her with a soothing voice. The other monsters, responding to an unspoken signal, moved further away so as not to intimidate the girl. To himself, the protagonist thought that since their entire group looked like monsters or simply were monsters, it was no surprise that the elf girl was frightened. However, they had long since developed a tried-and-true plan of action for such situations. The protagonist calmly told the girl that he knew how to control these monsters and that she had absolutely nothing to fear. The girl was still trembling, her back pressed against the tree, but curiosity got the better of her fear. She asked with interest, "How exactly do you control them?" Guy nodded smugly, casually waved his hand toward his companions, and explained that all these monsters were his friends. Very obedient and generally good guys, despite their fearsome appearance. The elf slowly rose from the ground, carefully brushed off her dress, and froze tensely for a few seconds, as if gathering her thoughts. Then she bowed low and sincerely apologized for being frightened. She explained that this was the first time in her life she had met someone like Guy. The protagonist laughed awkwardly and waved his hand, saying that of course he wasn't angry. It was a mere trifle. Their group had caught her off guard, so everything was fine. With these words, he began to punch Gear inside in a friendly manner. The dragon instantly got angry, growled, and they started arguing. Guy told him not to show off, since it didn't even hurt him, and Giran growled darkly in response that Guy would get it later. The evil eye laughed with obvious delight from the sidelines and muttered that these two were complete idiots. The elf watched the whole scene intently, at a loss for words. An ordinary guy casually chats with monsters. They snap at each other just like humans do, and yet was they who so easily took down an entire squad of the Akabane gang. She frowned resolutely and reminded herself that time was of the essence. She needed to ask this man for help immediately. Meanwhile, Guy and the monsters had moved slightly to the side, and the skeleton warrior asked in a low voice, wondering if they really thought the girl had been specifically targeted. Guy looked at her thoughtfully and, covering his mouth with his hand, muttered that she was clearly well-dressed, perhaps the daughter of some wealthy family, and the kidnappers might simply be counting on a ransom. Just then, the elf suddenly called out the protagonist's name. When everyone turned around, she bowed sharply and deeply, addressing him with respect as if he were a lord of monsters, and she began to beg him to follow her without asking any unnecessary questions. A short time later, they were all running through the night forest. Giran stayed close to the protagonist and muttered discontentedly that he simply couldn't abandon her to her fate. That was just the kind of person he was. The girl ran slightly ahead, showing the way and paying no attention to the conversation behind her. Indigai retorted to the dragon that they had no idea where to go anyway, and it was too late to jump off the ship. Giran didn't calm down and grumbled that this elf girl was somehow strange. She'd bolted ahead without really explaining anything, and he had a very bad feeling about it. The girl clearly looked like an aristocrat, and that always meant extra trouble. Guy shot him a mocking glance and asked, could it be that such a fearsome dragon was simply afraid? Suddenly, the elf stopped dead in her tracks. The monsters and Guy ran after her out of habit and found themselves in a large clearing. Before them stood a huge Western-style mansion, gloomy, covered in deep cracks with walls darkened by time and towers overgrown with thick ivy. The tall, pointed windows were boarded up, the massive wrought iron gates were touched with rust, and the crowns of ancient trees hung over the tiled roof, as if the forest had long and methodically been trying to swallow this place whole. Somewhere up above, a weather vane creaked, and the wind blew through a broken window on the second floor. It seemed as though the building had long since been abandoned and forgotten by everyone. The monsters froze in unison, silently staring at the sight. The dragon gasped in surprise and said that the huge Western-style mansion stood all alone right in the middle of the forest. There seemed to be no one inside. Could these really be genuine ruins, like in some fantasy world from a video game? The next second, a dense hail of arrows whistled toward them. Indigai barely managed to dodge, letting out a startled cry. Armed elves appeared on the second-floor railing. They furiously demanded to know who these strangers were and declared that the monsters would not be allowed any further. The protagonist, paying little attention to the threats, shook his fist in the air, and shouted indignantly that the arrow had come within a hair's breadth of hitting him. One of the elves, standing in front of the others, silently drew his bow and ordered them not to move in an icy voice. He issued a stern warning that any disobedience would be considered an invasion of the kingdom of Susaria. The evil eye hurriedly flew closer to the protagonist and whispered in his ear to watch out for the arrows. The dragon stood up straight warily beside him and asked the others in a low voice if they were ready to fight. ISEKAI'D stared intently at the enemies lined up on the railing and muttered thoughtfully, "Could it be that there are elves here too?" They didn't keep him waiting. They shouted in unison that there were monsters before them and gave the order to shoot. Just then, the rescued elf girl darted out, right in front of the protagonist and the monsters. She spread her arms wide to the sides, shielding the entire group with her body, and shouted at the top of her lungs to her comrades that these were not enemies. The chief archer lowered his bow in surprise and called her by name. Amin, that was the girl's name. Without stopping, she shouted that a whole squad of the ISEKAI'D gang had been chasing her, but the man standing next to her had helped her. His name is Guy. He is a monster tamer. She asked him to relay her words to Lady Deirdre and added that she would like to personally introduce her saviors. The elves on the railing exchanged tense glances, clearly hesitating, but they reluctantly opened the heavy doors. A voice came from deep within the mansion, announcing that Amin could enter. However, only the tamer would be allowed to accompany her. The monsters were to remain outside. The elf twitched her ears slightly and thanked Lady Deirdre loudly and respectfully. Giran moved closer to his classmate and whispered quietly that this could very well be a trap. Maybe he shouldn't go in there alone. Would everything be all right? An evil eye hovered anxiously nearby, clearly sharing the dragon's fears. The protagonist glanced back at them both, smiled calmly, and asked them not to worry. He'd be gone only a short while and would return soon. Then the elf girl Amin tugged at his sleeve and, in a low voice but very seriously, asked him to mind his manners inside the mansion. ISEKAI'D followed the girl into the mansion. He was greeted without any warmth. Several elves, who looked almost identical, eyed him sidelong with poorly concealed hostility, their gazes clinging to his every movement, cold and wary. A little to the side, by the wall, stood an older elf, with long hair pulled back and a staff in his hands, which he clutched with obvious tension. Amin stepped into the center of the spacious hall, looked around nervously, then dropped abruptly to one knee, resting her hand on the floor. And, bowing her head as low as possible, she solemnly announced her arrival. The protagonist involuntarily looked up, and he noticed that sitting on the massive throne before him was a girl who looked exactly like Amin. The same facial features, the same hair, the same sharp-cut eyes. Deirdre, the elf on the throne, spoke up. Clearly bored, she propped her cheek with her palm, rested her elbow on the armrest, and frowned in displeasure, giving Amin a long, scrutinizing look. Then she coldly asked her why she was still alive. The boy couldn't help but look more closely and suddenly realized both elves had exactly the same faces. Twins. Noticing his confusion, Deirdre frowned even more and sternly ordered her to answer. Amin fell to her knees, her shoulders shaking, tears streaming down her cheeks. She whispered that she'd been scared when ISEKAI'D's gang was chasing her. She'd just been thinking. Her voice broke. Then Amin added, louder, almost breaking into a scream, that she didn't want to die. She begged for forgiveness furiously. Who was she, anyway, to cling to life like this? To run, to call out to strangers for help. The elf sank her forehead into the cold floor and began to mumble through her tears that she didn't understand what she had done, and no matter how she tried to justify herself, her guilt could not be forgiven. After these words, Deirdre rose abruptly from the throne, swiftly closed the distance between them, and with a sweeping motion struck her sister in the head with the heel of her shoe, without warning, without hesitation. And she screamed furiously, asking what Amin would now order her to do if the bait suddenly started acting up, if it suddenly developed a mind of its own. Had she forgotten her purpose? Fool! Amin didn't deserve any better. What use was she now anyway? Deirdre pulled out her whip and began lashing the girl furiously, without stopping. Amin screamed and tried to apologize, covering her head with her hands. Deirdre gripped the whip tighter and bared her teeth. And she spoke, explaining through her rage that a coup had recently taken place in Susaria, and the king had been killed. Gillian, the leader of the rebels, had seized the royal castle and sent his men out to hunt down the surviving members of the ruling family. Deirdre lowered her hand for a second. Her voice grew colder and quieter, which made it sound even more terrifying. Most of her relatives had already been captured. Very few remained alive, and now her father's blood was being spilled, which is why she was obligated to survive at any cost. The princess whipped her whip sharply again and shouted that she needed Amin solely as a decoy. She was supposed to let herself be caught, was supposed to let the thugs grab her instead of her, to buy time for a retreat. That was her only task. The next second, Deirdre was already swinging again to strike the girl lying on the floor, but her arm was caught. It was Guy. The elf turned her head sharply and glared at the ordinary man who had dared to touch her. The protagonist held her wrist firmly and calmly, without a trace of threat in his voice, asked her to calm down. The situation was, of course, complicated and terrifying, but was it fair to blame Amin for everything? Deirdre shouted furiously, "How dare he?" and demanded he take his hands off her immediately. The young man immediately loosened his grip, let out an awkward gasp, and nodded in agreement, spreading his arms wide to show with his whole demeanor that there was no question of an attack. The princess's guards instantly stepped forward and crossed their swords in front of him. Deirdre looked at the stranger with undisguised irritation and turned to her sister, asking who on earth she had brought along. What kind of lunatic was this? Amin, sniffling, tried to justify herself and explained that Guy and his monsters were very strong. She thought they might be able to help. Deirdre turned her gaze back to the protagonist, paused for a second, and muttered that he was a monster tamer, as she had already been informed. Then she exhaled heavily and continued coldly. You can't act without thinking about the consequences. You can't drag strangers along without understanding what you're getting yourself into. She turned to Amin and asked if she even knew who exactly had been chasing her. Amin struggled to her feet, wiped away her tears, and at first whispered barely audibly that she knew. Then, having gathered her composure, she began to explain more loudly. It was the ISEKAI'D gang, a dangerous band of warriors, each endowed with a blessing. They had managed to defeat even the army of the entire nation of Gransel. Jillian had been dealing with them for a long time. Deirdre began to raise her voice again. After all, that was exactly what she'd been saying all along. Did Amin seriously think that this ordinary human boy could possibly stand a chance against such a gang? The princess exhaled heavily again and muttered that there was no time left. They had to act immediately. The next second, a dagger fell with a metallic clang onto the stone floor next to Amin's knees. The princess turned slightly toward her sister and quietly, almost matter-of-factly, ordered her to kill herself. The protagonist flinched toward the girl and begged her not to do it, to wait. The wounded elf picked up the dagger from the floor with trembling hands and slowly pressed it against her own throat. Tears were still streaming down her cheeks, but her hands didn't stop. However, in the next second, she was interrupted by a deafening explosion. The main doors were blown off their hinges. Heavy debris of wood and metal flew in all directions, and the blast wave hurled Amin several meters to the side. 3 figures appeared in the gap that had opened up. The elven guards instantly stepped forward, drew their swords, and demanded an explanation. 3 strangers stood in the shattered doorway. A striking girl with tousled hair and a defiant smirk on her lips named Jabi. She was clearly relishing the effect she had created. Standing next to her was a massive man with 2 swords strapped to his back and a huge, deep, old cross-shaped scar across half his head, named Damadou. And just behind him was a strange, silent man wearing a tribal mask that completely concealed his face, named Papati. The girl laughed mockingly and narrowed her eyes, scanning the hall. The man with the scar spoke first, asking with feigned surprise, could it be that the elven princess Deirdre has been hiding all this time in such a backwater? And then he added mockingly that they had come on Jillian's orders for the princess. The elves cried out in unison, overcome with panic and fear for the princess's life. Deirdre stepped forward slightly, her face set in a grim expression, and whispered angrily, "ISEKAI'D's gang." The twin guards immediately took up positions in front of the princess and the court mage, fiercely warning that no one was to approach. But the next second, one of them looked around in confusion and asked in a hoarse voice what had happened to the patrols outside. Had no one come to their aid? Damadou gave a short laugh in response and said it hadn't been difficult. The elves outside wouldn't help them. The building was completely surrounded, and now no one would escape from here. Damadou continued, mockingly and almost playfully suggesting that everyone present simply surrender. There was nowhere to run anyway, and there was no point in resisting. The protagonist stood slightly apart from the unfolding confrontation, gripping the hilt of his sword tightly, and silently watched every movement of the uninvited guests, trying to gauge how serious the situation was. Damadou slowly scanned the room and casually announced that all the elves outside, who were supposed to be guarding the mansion, were already dead by this point. The princess stumbled mid-sentence and bared her teeth in anger, and she asked loudly and sharply, "How could they possibly be dead? What was he talking about?" The bandit merely smirked in response and politely explained that if the girl came willingly, he would not harm her and would spare her life. Then he crossed his arms over his chest, leaned back smugly, and continued that as soon as they handed Deirdre over to Mr. Gillian, their mission would be over and everyone would go their separate ways. The princess shouted furiously in response that they were lying and she didn't believe a single word they said. Jabi shrugged with the air of someone who had absolutely nothing to worry about, grinned widely, and asked mockingly, why would they lie at all? They really would spare her. Why all this distrust? Deirdre frowned deeply, her face darkening, and she slowly, emphatically shook her head. She replied that being captured by these people was like death, almost worse than death. She knew the ISEKAI'D gang. She knew Gillian. She'd seen them stage public executions to announce the change of power to the entire country, without trial, without mercy, with deliberate cruelty for the sake of intimidation. Besides, if she fell into their hands, the resistance would collapse on its own, and she couldn't. She had no right to let herself be used for such purposes. She would never betray Susaria, no matter what happened. Jabi raised an eyebrow in surprise. For a split second, something resembling confusion flashed across her face, but she immediately masked it with a mocking smile and objected. Of course, no one is going to make an example of her. That would simply be foolish of Mr. Gillian. Such a move would only embolden the opposition and turn the people against him. After a brief pause, she announced loudly and clearly, the princess would live. Deirdre frowned even more in displeasure, her pointed ears drooping slightly, and she asked warily what exactly they meant by those words. Then Damadou spoke again, measuredly, almost lazily, as if explaining something self-evident. He said that Mr. Gillian had raised a rebellion, but the people still knew too few details about what had happened and why. The plan is both simple and beautiful. The ruler of the elven kingdom of Susaria had ruled cruelly, thinking only of his own enrichment and caring nothing for his subjects. But the righteous and beloved Princess Deirdre, together with the wise Minister Gillian, could not tolerate the injustice and rose up against her own father for the sake of her people's prosperity and freedom. Soon she will marry Gillian and rule Susaria alongside him, bringing peace and justice to the people. Such a happy ending for everyone. With every word she heard, Deirdre began to tremble. A slight shiver ran through her shoulders and arms, and her fingers clenched into white-knuckled fists. She asked again, her voice trembling with rage, how this man dared to say such a thing out loud. Damadou shrugged with a completely unperturbed expression and muttered that it was a good plan. At least the state wouldn't descend into chaos and civil war. Deirdre screamed furiously that she would never agree to it. Jabi shrugged again, making it clear with her whole demeanor that the princess's consent was entirely unnecessary in this case. She held out a small dark vial and coldly, matter-of-factly told the elf to drink its contents. It was a special kind of poison. It would render the princess completely incapacitated, but she would remain alive and appear perfectly healthy on the outside. All that would be required of her was to stand beside Lord Gillian at the right moment and create the necessary illusion for the people. Deirdre turned pale, her face went stiff, and she began to shake even more violently. She slowly lowered her head and began to mutter through clenched teeth. So was she who had rebelled against her father. So was she who had killed him in front of the entire kingdom. Then she snapped her head up and shouted furiously for the villains to stop spouting this nonsense immediately, and not to even dare think she would allow herself to be used in such a way. She sent Lord Gillian's plan to hell, not mincing her words. Damadou burst out laughing and shouted that she really was an incorrigible fool. The princess asked coldly and haughtily what exactly he found so funny. The man shrugged conciliatorily and spread his arms wide, saying that he was simply genuinely amazed. She still wouldn't give in, and in a way, that was even admirable. Jabi pointed at her and lazily remarked that, if one looked at it objectively, the princess had very few people left. Damadou sighed heavily and dramatically, took a few unhurried steps forward, and said that enough was enough. He asked them not to delay them any longer for no reason. The princess thrust her hand forward in a commanding gesture and fiercely ordered them not to approach. At that moment, three elves with identical appearances sprang out in front of her in a swift, coordinated movement. Judging by their appearance, they were also twin brothers, only there were three of them. All three, in unison and without a single note of discord in their tone, solemnly declared that in the name of Susaria and with their lives, they would not allow anyone to lay a finger on Princess Deirdre. In the next instant, without another word, they executed a coordinated combat maneuver. The three brothers strike. A triangular cut. All three soared into the air simultaneously, gaining altitude at incredible speed, and descended upon the enemy from three sides at once. Swiftly, in perfect unison, without a single superfluous movement, as if a single finely tuned mechanism operating in complete harmony. The whistling of 3 blades tore through the air simultaneously from different directions, leaving the opponent literally zero room to maneuver. It was impossible to dodge a strike from 3 sides at once. Indigai reflexively gripped the hilt of his sword tighter and glanced at the princess in confusion. She was already ordering to cut off the bandits' heads, clenching her fists in anticipation of the inevitable victory. To herself, she thought they were incredibly lucky. Right now, at exactly the right moment, her 3 guards had managed to execute this most powerful and foolproof technique. At the very beginning of their history, this combination had killed mercenaries without a single exception. Not a single opponent had ever returned alive from a simultaneous strike by 3 high-class swordsmen attacking from different sides. If they managed to defeat the leader right now, the remaining elves would have a real chance. The brothers would deal with the rest of the gang in exactly the same way, and they would flee. They'll definitely run away from here. The 3 elves had practically reached their target. Their blades were hurtling toward the enemy. The princess stood slightly to the side and watched the outcome with undisguised triumph. However, all 3 blades were blocked in an instant, simultaneously. Damadou used his combat skill, 4 hands. A second pair of arms shot out from his body like lightning, intercepting all 3 swords at once with frightening ease. He muttered mockingly that the work was, of course, not bad and deserved praise. But there were only 3 attackers, and he had 4 hands, so the odds were clearly not in their favor. The princess and the elves froze in confusion, unable to believe their eyes. Damadou grinned even wider and added, "Well then, now they'll be able to really dance without a warm-up." Without the slightest pause, he then used his second skill, the grace of 4 hands, moon transformation. All 4 hands simultaneously burst into rapid motion, tracing wide, deadly arcs in all directions with monstrous speed and absolute precision. Every movement calculated, every swing inevitable, not a single superfluous gesture. The air in the hall literally howled with the speed. Within a few short seconds, not a single part of the 3 elf twins remained standing. They collapsed onto the stone floor almost simultaneously, almost silently. The man slowed down slightly, glanced at his defeated opponents with the look of someone who had grown a little bored, and laughed in disappointment. He turned to the rest of the thugs and asked why they had even bothered to stand up. Did they really think it would be that easy? Could 3 swords defeat Lord Damadou? What kind of bodyguards does the princess have? It's just ridiculous and pathetic at the same time. The next second, he rushed at the remaining elves, laughing almost maniacally at the top of his lungs and shouting to the entire room that he was going to cut them all to pieces. The 2 remaining thugs exchanged glances. Jabi groaned that Damadou had lost his temper again, and now there was no stopping him. She turned to Papadi and ordered him to go help the people outside. Here, she and Damadou would be enough. The man nodded silently and left the building. The main character stood frozen in a corner, trying to make sense of the situation. He had stumbled into someone else's conflict completely by accident. To put it simply, the mercenaries were hunting the runaway princess, and he and his monster friends had absolutely nothing to do with it. He paused for a second, his gaze fixed on the enraged elf, and wondered, should he help the princess or stay out of it? He couldn't trust any of them. Maybe he should just run away? He immediately snapped out of it. That wasn't an option. Everyone had already seen his face. His thoughts were interrupted by the elf princess's loud scream. Deirdre glared furiously at the bandits. Then she spun around to face Guy and shouted that she was hiring him, and ordered him to help her. The protagonist froze, his expression impassive, and he reminded her that hadn't she told him just a few minutes ago not to meddle in matters that weren't his business? The princess waved her hands and explained furiously that everything had changed now. She was hiring him, and that was that. The guy frowned and said nothing. Deirdre pressed her hands to her chest in panic and stammered, asking what he wanted in return. She would do everything in her power. Indigai muttered that he'd like any information about vampire hideouts and monster crystals. Did the princess or her entourage know anything about that? The elf accepted the condition and pointed to the carnage before them, where Damadou was still fiercely slaughtering her subjects. The protagonist nodded, smiled, and through the local communication device, a small cup with a string stretched across it, asked if his friends could hear him. And he gave the order, deal with the enemies outside, and whoever wants to can come inside and fight alongside him. Meanwhile, Damadou had dealt with almost all the elves. He laughed triumphantly, held his hands out in front of him, and slowly moved toward the princess, mockingly asking if that was really all her bodyguards were capable of. After all, there was no one left. Deirdre shouted at him not to dare come any closer. The man grinned widely and muttered that the girl clearly hated him. Then, with a sinister smile, he added that nevertheless, the stronger a woman is, the more satisfying it is to break her. At that moment, the protagonist blocked his path. Damadou asked in surprise, "Who is this guy anyway?" Guy looked at him calmly, without blinking, and muttered that since the princess had just hired him, he should introduce himself. "His name is Guy, and he's glad to meet you." Damadou rushed forward with a furious shout that he was warning him just once. He should get out of the way, or he'd kill him. The blow almost hit its mark, but Guy stood there looking clearly bored, not moving a muscle. And he calmly muttered that he apologized, but it was clearly not him who would have to fight him. Suddenly, the ceiling collapsed above them. A crash, a cloud of dust, debris flying in all directions. From the swirling dust emerged the dragon Girin, who roared loudly that he was tired of waiting outside, and it was finally time to make some noise. Both thugs stared at the monster with undisguised surprise. Girin moved closer to the protagonist, keeping his eyes fixed on the enemies, and asked, "Were these two his targets?" Guy nodded in agreement, and noted that the bearded one with the scar clearly looked like the leader, which meant he was the strongest. Damadou exhaled, and then he burst out laughing, admitting that he'd already managed to get scared. His partner also burst out laughing and exclaimed, "Is their trump card really just an overgrown lizard?" Damadou chimed in, choking with laughter and asking what on earth they were supposed to do with such a lizard, saddle it or something. The girl burst out laughing again and suggested paying much more and throwing in some treats to boot. An image from a past life flashed through Girin's mind. An identical gang had stood before him, mocking his nickname, saying, "Who's this Glenn the Storm? Nobody knows anyone like that. Where did this loser even come from?" The dragon gave a grim smile to himself as he returned to the present. He thought that whether in this world or his own, people were equally infuriating. He spoke aloud to Guy and asked if these people were clearly underestimating him. Guy shrugged and muttered that idiots are idiots everywhere. Girin said he would leave the girl with Indigai and deal with the thug himself. He thought such insolence had to be punished. Otherwise, these two, or anyone else who dares to mock him, could destroy what he holds dear. He'll make them regret this encounter. In this world, there are those you don't mess with, and he was one of them. With that thought, he lunged forward. While the protagonist watched Girin prepare for battle, Jabi attacked him from behind. Only thanks to years of training in various martial arts did he manage to parry the blow. Then, with an impassive expression, he turned to her and asked, "Is it customary to attack like that, without warning?" The girl replied that since their partners had already settled their differences, it was time for them to start as well. She paused for a second and asked. She'd overheard the conversation with the princess. Was the guy standing before her really a monster tamer? The protagonist smirked and asked in return, "Were you eavesdropping?" Without waiting for an answer, he grunted and said he wasn't in the mood for a fight. After all, there was a girl standing in front of him. She grunted. Guy added that he didn't want to kill her and suggested they stop before it was too late. The girl screamed furiously. Hadn't he heard about the Char Jabi? Such ignorance made the veins on her forehead bulge. Jabi kept yelling that she really didn't like his laid-back attitude. The guy calmly took a small step to the side. The girl laughed and asked, did he really think luck would help him slip away? Then she held her hand out in the other direction and announced that the estate was completely cordoned off. Not even a mouse could slip through. Just then, a black silhouette flashed in the window behind her and vanished immediately. The protagonist said quietly, but with a threat in his voice, that he could say the same thing. Not a single mouse would leave the estate. She could believe him. Jabi raised an eyebrow, not understanding what he meant. And the protagonist continued, saying that all the bandits outside were already in danger. The monsters had been ordered not to let anyone out. A strange man had settled in a tree outside. He pressed his face against the spyglass, scrutinizing everything happening around the estate, and laughed with anticipation. Then he muttered to himself, noting how many new faces there were, and that this country was sinking deeper and deeper into chaos, which meant it was getting more and more interesting. 3 monsters, a golem, an evil eye, and a skeleton warrior, were rampaging in the clearing in front of the estate. In a few minutes, they had nearly finished off all the bandits outside. The evil eye soared higher and shouted excitedly that it seemed the elves had decided to form an alliance with them, which meant the monsters had to help get rid of the enemies, and the thought made it grin wildly. The skeleton warrior once again knocked off the head of one of the bandits and grimly noted that the entrance was blocked. They couldn't go inside and help their friend. The evil eye asked excitedly if there was one of their own on the roof. Could he go up there? In response, the golem clenched another bandit in his fist, indifferently crushing all his organs, and muttered that this one could do whatever he wanted. Meanwhile, on the roof, Arachnia Satoshi was engaged in a fierce battle with Papati. She used her secret technique, the monster's 48 kicks, A rapid series of strikes raining down on the enemy from all sides, each precise, each devastating. However, at the last second, Papati somehow managed to react and leap back with lightning speed. He ended up hanging upside down from a tree. He cursed through clenched teeth and muttered that those damn elves had somehow managed to tame the monsters. But he was the strongest warrior of the Melion tribe. He wouldn't lose to this stupid spider woman for anything. The next second, he furiously threw his dagger, cutting the web thread in front of him. He laughed nastily and shouted that she deserved it. Then he whispered that she would now see his true form. His body seemed to multiply, and it vanished into the night air without a trace. Arachnia looked around in frustration, thinking he had somehow escaped. The next moment, an axe was past her face, barely grazing her cheek. The girl frowned. She wiped away the blood with her thumb, and she smiled in annoyance. An opponent she couldn't even see had managed to wound her. A quiet voice from the darkness, belonging to an invisible figure, whispered that she should stop resisting. She was only making things worse for herself. Inside the manor, the protagonist was still fighting Jabi, and there was no clear winner. The girl attacked fiercely and unpredictably. The dagger flashed now to the right, now to the left. She changed the rhythm and direction of her strikes at the last split second, making it impossible to catch a pattern. Guy parried every attack, barely managing to keep up, diving under a strike, sidestepping with a sliding step, blade meeting blade with a clang. He deflected one lunge at the last moment, let another graze his shoulder, and parried a third, turning her own momentum against her. His movements were precise and economical. Not a single superfluous gesture, only what was necessary. He leaped backward, somersaulted over his head, landed, and immediately sidestepped the dagger thrown after him. It struck the stone column behind him with a clang. However, Jabi's pace didn't let up. She pressed on, giving him no respite, and with every passing second it became clearer that he couldn't keep this up for long. Guy dropped to one knee and tried to catch his breath, never taking his eyes off his opponent. Jabi said that, to be honest, she hadn't expected much from a monster tamer, but as it turned out, he was quite skilled with a sword. She grinned grimly and began tossing the dagger in her hand. Guy thanked her with a frown. Jabi bared her teeth even wider, looking like a wild beast that had caught the scent of prey, and continued, saying that it wouldn't change anything anyway. The probability of their mission success was now 100%. The outcome was a foregone conclusion. Suddenly, she held out her left hand and pointed to the small marks on it. She asked him to take a look. She had made a notch for every person she'd killed, but stopped counting after 200. She cheerfully noted that Guy would also be carved into this arm forever. And she asked, wasn't that an honor? Suddenly, she pointed her finger somewhere behind him and asked him to look there. There stood an exhausted Gurin, trying to catch his breath. The protagonist turned around and, in a panic, called out his nickname, asking how he was. The dragon turned his head slightly toward his friend and said with a smirk not to worry, but added that he hadn't expected this after all. Damadou stood a little to the side and burst out laughing, muttering that the lizard thought he could defeat him. Then he admitted that he, too, had expected something a little different. The next second, he began waving his arms furiously, trying to pierce the dragon's scales. But to no avail. Damadou cursed and said he couldn't hurt it because its hide was too tough. Then the man snorted, nodded to himself, and muttered that the monster should be glad. It would be granted a fraction of his full power. The next second, Damadou let out a loud scream and unleashed a special technique, unbreakable strength. His body began to change rapidly. His muscles swelled and bulged to monstrous proportions. His skin stretched taut over the bulges, and the veins stood out in relief all over his body. All four arms were filled with incredible power, each as thick as a small tree, each capable of shattering stone with a single movement. No sooner had he completed his transformation than, without a swing, he flung the dragon aside with a single swift motion. Gurin hadn't expected such strength. He was flung like a rag doll, and with the full force of the blow, he slammed into the stone wall of the estate, leaving a deep dent in it. He slid down heavily, groaned loudly, and coughed up blood. The protagonist almost rushed over, shouting his name. But Jabi immediately blocked his path. She laughed and asked him not to get distracted from their battle. Guy cursed and tried to pull his arm free. The girl instantly grabbed his other hand, along with the sword. She bared her teeth and whispered that he'd finally been caught. The protagonist cried out in alarm, not understanding what was happening. The next second, a blinding flash lit up the estate. A deafening explosion blew all the windows out of their frames at once, sending shards of glass and small splinters of wood flying in all directions. Where the protagonist had been standing a second ago, a wide, shallow pit gaped open. The stone floor had been blown out by the explosion. Bitter smoke still smoldered at the edges, and a cloud of stone dust hung in the air. Jabi was lightly covered in soot, but stood with a triumphant look, mockingly surveying the work of her hands, and loudly proclaimed that that was it. It was done. This was her blessing, the spawn of gunpowder. Just behind her, Damadou burst out laughing and said almost affectionately to his partner that her nickname suited her perfectly, Charred Jabi. The girl turned to him, spread her arms, and remarked nonchalantly that killing this boy had turned out to be too easy, almost boring. Damadou nodded in agreement. The dragon had been a weakling too, failing to live up to expectations. Then he turned to the princess, who stood frozen with tension, and offered her to come with them. Standing next to the elf was the last surviving elf, Gondal, captain of the royal guard. He bared his teeth, cursed under his breath, and held his sword out in front of him. And he prepared to fight, even though he knew full well what his chances were. The princess rubbed her chin in annoyance, twitched her ears, and lowered it, muttering gloomily that the monster she had hired had turned out to be completely useless. Gondal asked Deirdre to hide behind him. He would protect the princess even at the cost of his own life. It was his duty and honor. Everyone froze in tense silence, waiting to see who would be the first to charge forward. Girin lay against the wall, breathing with difficulty, and, unnoticed by everyone, slipped into a memory, a very recent one. Indigai had then turned to all his monster classmates and asked how this world differed from their own. The evil eye was the first to answer quietly. The most important difference was the attitude toward the value of life. In their home world, even the lowest scum would hesitate before killing a human. Somewhere deep inside, something human would kick in and stop their hand. Here, everything is different. Here, that doesn't exist. The dragon muttered that it sounded strange and even creepy. The evil eye continued. The value of life in the new world is incomparably lower, and it's quite possible that this is precisely why they were reborn as monsters. This world made it clear to them from the very beginning who they were destined to become. Then it turned to Girin separately and said that he would soon feel this for himself, not understand it with his mind, but actually feel it with his whole body. The dragon stared intently at his clawed paws, examining them as if seeing them for the first time, and thought, could it really be that serious? He had fought countless people throughout his past life, but murder was something entirely different. Was he capable of it? In this world, there was one rule: kill or be killed. And sooner or later, he would have to choose. Girin returned to the present, gradually coming to his senses. The pain in his body was still throbbing. D'Amato's blow had been monstrous. The stone wall still bore a deep dent from his body, reminding everyone of what had happened here. But what he felt now was no longer pain. It was a cold, steady, utterly calm rage, not hot and blind, but focused on a single point like a flame beneath glass. He rose to his feet, slowly, with effort, clinging to the stone wall with his claws and tearing a heavy chunk from it with such ease as if it were made of sand. The dragon whispered menacingly that he was surprised. All this time, he had been preoccupied with one thing. Damadou, that annoying four-armed man who thought he had settled everything with a single blow. He couldn't care less about the elven princess and her people, nor about the battle raging around him. Right now, there was only one face on his mind. He spoke aloud, louder this time, deliberately drawing the bandits' attention, saying that if this Damadou was considered the strongest in the Akabane gang, then that was very strange, because the dragon wouldn't leave a wet spot where he stood. That guy was absolutely nothing. The gangsters turned around. For a split second, genuine, unfeigned fear flashed across their faces, because the dragon, who just a few minutes ago had been hurled into a stone wall with monstrous force, was standing before them, alive. Not a single scratch on his scales, not a trace of fatigue in his eyes. Damadou shouted in shock that this was impossible. He'd struck it with the force of several diamond blows, putting everything he had into it, and yet it had simply gotten back up as if nothing had happened. Apparently, this wasn't just a lizard. He furiously braced for battle, positioning all four of his massive fists in front of him, his muscles swelling with power once more. But Girin didn't care. He took several slow, deliberately heavy steps forward, and each step echoed with a thud on the stone floor, making the walls seem to tremble. His gaze alone, cold, utterly impassive, devoid of any emotion, instilled a primal terror that made one want to flee without looking back. He clenched his paws into fists, bared his fangs in a wide grin, and let out a short growl for the thugs to hear. The next second, he lunged forward with such speed that his silhouette turned into a blurred shadow and unleashed the dragon claw attack. Huge claws pierced through two of D'Amato's four arms with terrifying surgical precision, severing them in a single short, almost careless motion. A deafening scream pierced the silence of the manor. The man recoiled in panic, overwhelmed by a wave of pain, blood gushing from the stumps, flooding the stone floor. He screamed, unable to comprehend how such a thing was even possible. Jabi rushed to her partner, shouting his name with undisguised horror in her voice, unable to believe her own eyes. The dragon snorted and muttered grimly that he wasn't going to waste time on pathetic bandits. It's time to finish this. Enough lazing around. Guren roared loudly, and the roar echoed throughout the estate, causing the remaining glass to rattle and small debris to fall from the ceiling. Then, behind the bandits, something stirred in the darkness. Guy stepped out of the shadows. Guren called out his name with obvious relief. The protagonist muttered grimly that Jabi was quite the witch. The girl spun around abruptly, and for the first time, genuine panic flashed across her face. She shouted that he was supposed to be dead and asked in desperation why he was still alive. The next second, she lunged forward, trying to reach him with her dagger, abruptly from a spin, aiming for his throat. Guy, looking completely unperturbed, ducked under the blow, stepping aside softly and almost lazily, and as a result, Jabi, carried by her momentum, flew straight into her bleeding partner, slamming into him with her shoulder. Guy called the dragon's name loudly. The dragon roared in response, and declared that they would deal with these scoundrels together, as always. In the next second, Guren unlocked a new ability within himself, the form of the dragon Kabors, deliverance from evil, the breath of the blue dragon. Its chest began to glow from within with an intensifying cold blue light. The light seeped between the scales, spreading across its entire body in bright streaks, transforming the dragon into a blazing blue silhouette in the middle of the dark hall. It radiated a heat unlike ordinary fire, deeper, more ancient, as if the very space around it was beginning to tremble and melt. The bandits screamed in panic and scattered, but it didn't save them. A mighty pillar of blue flame burst from Guren's maw. Not mere fire, but something alive and purposeful, ravenous and unstoppable. The flame pierced right through the manor's walls, like a red-hot blade cutting through paper, incinerating everything in its path and blasting a massive hole outward, through which the night air rushed in, mingling with smoke and ash. The roar of the explosion was probably heard throughout the entire night forest, and in the silence that followed, not a single enemy remained standing. The dragon, slightly battered but full of energy and strength, raised its head and growled with satisfaction. Did Guy see what he just done? It was the attack of a true dragon. Nothing remained of the enemies but ashes. The protagonist stared silently ahead. In the floor of the manor gaped a huge hole shaped like a beam, burned right through by blue flame. Everything that had been in its path just moments ago had simply ceased to exist. He stared at it in complete shock, at a loss for words. Guren, standing next to him, smiled slightly and asked if he was really surprised. Then he added that he was certain this was far from the limit of his abilities. Just then, a girl's voice called out to them. The dragon and the man turned around almost in unison. The elven princess Deirdre stepped forward and announced loudly that they had both done well. They had defeated the Akabane gang. She shouldn't have underestimated the monster tamer. Guy spoke next. He addressed the princess and said that her subordinates had suffered greatly, and he was very sorry, but it was good that they had at least managed to save her. The princess held out her hand, pointed at herself, and explained curtly. The main thing was that she was unharmed. Her life was necessary to preserve the royal lineage. She frowned, lowered her ears, and said that with her death, the dynasty would come to an end. Then she fell silent for a second and continued fiercely, almost without inflection, that this was precisely why sacrifices were permissible if they were unavoidable. Guren and Guy exchanged glances and glared grimly at the elf. The dragon was the first to snap and asked how she could even speak like that while standing next to the bodies of her own subordinates. How shameless. The protagonist quietly shushed him and muttered that perhaps, for those of royal blood, this was simply the way of things. The princess, noticing that they had stopped paying attention to her, shouted furiously at the remaining elves to get ready to leave immediately. They were heading to Dad. Then the main character spoke up again. He gasped and asked, "What about their reward?" The girl had promised them the information the elves possessed. The elf gasped, her face darkened, and she managed with great difficulty to say that she had to tell us about vampires and crystals. And the next second, she smiled mockingly and declared that she knew nothing. Guren and Guy exchanged another glance, frowned, and widened their eyes in surprise. The protagonist shouted, "How is that possible?" She promised to provide the information as a reward. The elf replied quietly but firmly that she had never said she even had that information. The guy continued to protest. How dare she? What on earth was she talking about? She was just a liar. The girl spread her arms and said with feigned sincerity that she had been desperate, and now she was ready to give them money instead. Then she lowered her hands and, without a trace of embarrassment, muttered that they both already knew who she was, and she was ready to do anything for the throne of Susaria. The next second, the princess suddenly froze. Her mouth fell open, her eyes widened. A blade had pierced right through her body. Everyone around her froze in surprise. The princess began coughing up blood and asked in confusion, "What's happening?" Behind her stood Gondal, somber, tense, a bloodied sword in his hand. His face was stony. The surviving elf mage was the first to recover. He shouted that Gondal had gone mad and immediately cast a spell of ice hail. The next second, the captain of the guard was thrown aside by several ice crystals that pierced his body. He slammed into the wall and slid down. The mage rushed to the elf, calling her name in a breaking voice. He knelt down beside her, wrapped his arms around her, and held her as tightly as he could, as if trying to keep her life inside. And through his tears he asked, after everything Gondal had done for them, why? Why had he done this? Gondal, bleeding profusely, struggled to part his lips. He muttered that it was because of his daughter. She had been killed as the princess's double, flesh of his flesh. He couldn't accept it, and so he swore revenge. Barely breathing, he continued, saying that he had revealed the princess's location to the bandits, but they had fallen, and she had survived. That was precisely why he had decided to cut off that cursed lineage with his own hands. Let her be grateful to him. Those were Gandalf's last words. He breathed his last, and his body went limp. The elder elf still held the girl close to him. His hands began to tremble slightly. He paused for a long second, staring into space, and then muttered quietly, "So that's how it is." And he said that Gandalf's daughter had died a noble death, and that this should have made him even more devoted to the royal family. No one knew what thoughts had actually been brewing in his mind all these years. And that was his mistake. He failed to recognize such a human emotion as the despair of a father who had lost his daughter. A man with such pain in his soul is incapable of remaining loyal. He is capable only of revenge. Susaria cannot be led by one who makes such miscalculations. Then, behind him, a loud, wrenching cough rang out, drawing the attention of everyone still alive in this ruined hall. The protagonist and Gurin turned toward the cough and saw before them, as it initially appeared to them, Amin. The girl was covered in blood, barely able to stand, and with difficulty uttered a sincere apology, addressing Amin by name. The two men exchanged confused glances, not understanding what was going on. The wounded girl in the older elf's arms let out a faint gasp and asked her not to apologize. She was glad to help Lady Deirdre. It was her honor and her choice. She began to shake slightly and struggled to reach out her hand toward the twin. And then it became clear the one bleeding in the mage's arms was the real Amin, and the one standing before them, alive, was the real Princess Deirdre. With her last ounce of strength, Amin murmured words of gratitude to the lady. Tears streamed down her cheeks, and with a quiet, barely perceptible smile, she asked the princess to continue living, for her sake, for the sake of everyone who had given their lives for her, and to be sure to take care of her family. The princess promised in a trembling voice that she would not forget anyone. Amin quietly thanked her one last time, and her hand slowly fell, her eyes closed. A heavy, oppressive silence hung in the hall, broken only by the crackling of debris and the distant night wind blowing through the shattered walls. Guy and Gurin stood slightly to the side, silently watching the whole scene. Neither of them could find words. Too many deaths in too short a time, and each one was real, significant, impossible to simply accept and forget. At that moment, Princess Deirdre abruptly stood up, walked over to them, and bowed slightly in a brief but sincere gesture. She apologized to the protagonist and said that it was all her fault he had gotten into such serious trouble. She added quietly that she was the real Deirdre. She gently wiped away the tears still streaming down her cheeks and explained with barely concealed sadness. They had planned to leave Susaria unnoticed, but their location had been revealed. All of their closest subordinates were now in danger. And that was exactly why she and Amin had switched places before their escape. Gondal knew nothing of this. He thought he was killing the princess, not her double. The protagonist stared in shock at the real Deirdre, who was so strikingly different from the haughty and cold girl on the throne he had seen before. Standing before him was someone else, alive, broken by grief but not defeated. The elf continued, apologizing for everything that had happened and saying they must leave immediately before new pursuers arrived. Tears streamed from her eyes again, and she said, unable to hide the tremor in her voice, that the souls of her defenders would weigh heavily on her shoulders for the rest of her life. She would not let their sacrifices be in vain. She would survive no matter what, for the sake of each and every one of them. So the protagonist, along with his monster classmates, escorted the princess and the remaining elves to a neighboring city where their allies were waiting. He would never have thought before that they would develop a good relationship with the elven race. But life in this world had long since ceased to conform to any expectations. After some time, they found themselves in the trading city of Dad. ISEKAI'D and his classmates had no idea where to look for the next crystal with a comrade trapped inside. But by a lucky coincidence, it turned out to be right here in the neighboring city. Monsters couldn't enter Dad without drawing unnecessary attention, so the protagonist went alone. The crystal stood right in the town's central square, as if nothing were amiss, as if it had simply been left there, as if it were part of the townscape. Guy rushed toward it and froze a few steps away, watching it shimmer in the daylight, cold, flickering, almost alive. Something was moving inside. The boy frowned and peered more closely, and suddenly widened his eyes in surprise. The silhouette inside was clearly humanoid, just like him. ISEKAI'D looked around nervously. There were no soldiers in sight. The square was bustling with a noisy rhythm of commerce, and no one was paying the crystal any particular attention. This was his chance. He reached out, touched the smooth surface of the crystal with his palm, and cast his special spell of liberation. In the next second, the crystal shattered into tiny, sparkling shards that scattered in all directions. Guy stared in shock at the girl who had appeared from inside. It was Akina, completely naked, bewildered, standing in the middle of the central square of the trading city, surrounded by passers-by who were gradually beginning to turn around. To be continued. Thanks for watching. Write your feedback in the comments. If you like the story, please like and subscribe. See you soon.